Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we tackle those dense stacks of sources and really pull out the core ideas for you, making sense of the thinking that shapes our world. Today, we're diving into a particularly potent and, let's say, controversial work. And this deep dive is actually part of Dr. Dario Santucci's series, Os libros que me tornaram quem sou, the books that made me who I am. The book itself is Olavo de Carvalho's 1995, O Jardim das Afflictions, that's the Garden of Afflictions. Now, if you've encountered this book, you'll know it's not your standard academic fare. Our sources call it electrifying, incredibly rich, unique. It sort of blends philosophy, reporting, political argument.
It really does. And it speaks directly to the reader, doesn't it? There's an urgency there.
Exactly. It basically shouts, this stuff matters to you right now.
And the way it gets there is fascinating. It takes what seems like a small local event, this philosophy lecture series, and uses it as a kind of keyhole.
A keyhole to view.
To view the whole landscape of modern thinking, its hidden aims, its strategies, you could say, it's looking for a universal pattern in a specific moment. And the structure, it builds like a crescendo, the book says. You don't get the full picture, the core argument, until the last two parts.
That you're called.
Os brazos da cruz, the arms of the cross, and Caesar redivivus, Caesar reborn. The author apparently saw these as the heartbeat of the work. The systole and diastole.
So the contraction and expansion of the main idea.
Precisely. It's tracing this decay, this intellectual and ethical slide that the book argues sets the stage for a new kind of empire.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. The trigger. You mentioned a lecture series.
That's right. It all kicked off with these ethics conferences at MASP, the São Paulo Museum of Art, way back in May 1990. And one lecture in particular on Epicurus really set things in motion for the author.
So that lecture becomes the case study.
Exactly. It's the launching point for this wider critique of what the book calls the modern intellectual class. And it draws this really sharp line between the true philosopher and the modern philosopher.
Okay, that distinction feels important. Can you unpack that for us? What's the difference?
Well, the true philosopher, I think Socrates, maybe Leibniz, they're driven by a desire to understand reality just for its own sake, an honest search for truth, whatever the cost.
Okay. And the philosopher?
The philosopher in this view is more like an ideologue. They seek explanation, sure, but only as much as needed to back up their existing ideas or to persuade their followers.
So it's not about truth-finding, it's about justification, winning an argument.
It's about effectiveness.
Yeah.
Social, political effectiveness, which the book argues naturally leads to manipulation.
Right. And the book points to specific examples from those MASP talks.
It does. Two key ones. First, there's the failure to provide the status questionis.
Which means?
Basically the state of the question, the history of the discussion, the scholarly consensus, the disagreements. If you're talking to a general audience and you leave that out,
They might think your opinion is the only one.
Yeah.
Or the accepted one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You present your view as the truth, uncontested. It removes the context needed for people to actually judge critically.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a kind of intellectual blindfolding. What was the second manipulation?
This one's maybe even more striking. It's about distorting history, specifically the entire medieval period.
How so?
The book claims they basically squeezed 1,000 years of really complex philosophy and ethics, Aquinas, Scotus, all of that down to just one thing, the Holy Inquisition.
Wow. Just reducing it all to that single image.
Yeah. And the book stresses this is a distortion because, chronologically, the Inquisition's most intense periods, say the 15th, 17th centuries.
That comes after the main figures of medieval philosophy.
Right. So by constantly tying the whole era to the Inquisition, they achieve two things. They avoid talking about the actual philosophical substance, and they paint Christianity with this sort of negative, bloody brush.
Making it easy to dismiss.
It's persuasion through, let's call it toxic association, pure rhetoric.
Okay, let's get back to Epicurus then, since that lecture was the spark. The book apparently criticizes a disconnect in his philosophy.
Yes, between his ethics, how to live, and his physics, his view of the universe. Specifically, this idea of atoms having Kleineman.
Kleineman, that's the random swing.
The spontaneous, unpredictable movement of atoms that allows them to, seek pleasure and avoid pain in the Epicurean system. But the book argues this cosmology isn't really logically sound on its own.
So if it's not sound science or logic, what's its purpose, according to the book?
It functions as a kind of philosophical bait A mirage. It offers people this seemingly intellectual justification for focusing on personal comfort, on relieving trivial anxieties, as the book puts it.
So the appeal is the comfort, not the coherence.
The comfort is the hook, yeah. And the logical gaps are sort of papered over.
And this is where the political critique really kicks in, right? This method using a pleasing surface idea to mask a deeper agenda.
Connects directly to the Marxist idea of praxis. That's the argument.
How does that connection work?
The text sees Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, the famous one about philosophers interpreting the world. But the point is to change it as basically an Epicurean inheritance.
Meaning?
By collapsing the distance between thinking about the world, theory, and acting upon it, praxis, you kind of eliminate the space needed for objective truth to exist independently.
Ah, so theory just becomes a tool to justify whatever action you've already decided on.
Precisely. It's rationalization after the fact. If truth isn't the goal, isn't independent, then all that's really left is power, isn't it?
Okay, so we've gone from corrupt philosophy to political justification. The next step in the book seems to be psychological manipulation.
That's the link, yes. Corrupt ideas pave the way for corrupting the mind itself. And the book makes this really bold claim that the 20th century wasn't just the atomic age or the information age, but fundamentally the century of mental enslavement.
That's a huge statement.
It is, but it points to this massive buildup of techniques for psychological control.
Yeah.
Things we know about.
Like what? The sources mentioned?
Conditioned reflexes, Pavlov's style, brainwashing techniques, subliminal messaging, NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, even things like contradictory stimulation.
And this isn't just theory. It's stuff used in the real world.
According to the analysis, absolutely. In political engineering, advertising, propaganda, even in what it calls pseudo-religious cults.
There was a specific example about subliminal messages, wasn't there? Something about a supermarket?
Yes, quite a chilling one. A study where they supposedly embedded a barely audible voice in the background music saying something like, "I am honest, I will not steal."
And the result?
A reported 37% drop in shoplifting. The idea is that your mind receives and acts on the command without you ever consciously hearing it.
Wow. Okay, that's passive control. What about the more aggressive stuff, like contradictory stimulation? How does that work?
Well, think about Pavlov's dogs, but applied to human psychology, or techniques reportedly used in political re-education or some high-pressure cults. You bombard someone with intense, conflicting messages or emotional pressures.
To what end?
To create cognitive dissonance on a massive scale. It paralyzes your ability to think clearly, your conscious judgment, you get emotionally exhausted, and then snap.
Personality change.
A sudden breakdown, making the person incredibly vulnerable to accepting a completely new, often much simpler way of thinking. A new ideology fills the void.
So, if the mind is this vulnerable, what does that do to our sense of ethics? The book talks about an inversion regarding sin and failure.
Yeah, it traces this weird modern idea where, because maybe some notion of providence or the universe is supposed to guarantee success if you're aligned,
Then failure isn't just bad luck, it's your fault.
it becomes a sign of being unbalanced. Desequilibrio, as the book puts it. Sin isn't offending God anymore, it's being out of sync.
So being in debt or sick or just unsuccessful, that becomes a moral failing.
It can generate this immense personal shame. The book argues this is useful for elites because it makes systemic problems feel like individual flaws. It's always your fault you didn't succeed.
And all this, the intellectual confusion, the psychological vulnerability leads to the book's concept of the modern state as the state bedel. What's a bedel?
Think of a warden or a strict school official, a disciplinarian. The state, often through these moralizing campaigns like the one critiqued at MASP.
Encourages citizens to demand more rights.
Exactly, which sounds good, right? But more rights inevitably mean more laws to define and enforce them.
Which means more bureaucracy.
A lot more. Tax agencies, police, courts, public education systems, they all expand relentlessly to manage these ever-increasing rights.
And the end result of this cycle.
According to the book, isolation and infantilization. People get overwhelmed by the complexity of their own rights and the laws governing them. They become totally dependent on the state bedel, the bureaucracy, to navigate their lives.
So the state creates the dependency it claims to solve?
That's the critique, yes. It fosters helplessness.
All right, let's bring this towards the conclusion. The book connects all this decay, intellectual, psychological, to a deeper philosophical shift. It talks about losing the vertical sense.
Yes, the vertical axis. That's the connection to the transcendent, to God, to metaphysical reality. When that sense is lost or ignored,
The mind focuses only on the horizontal.
Exactly. The two dimensions of the physical world take over completely. Space becomes the focus of naturalism, worship of the cosmos, and time becomes the focus of historicism, the worship of society or the historical process itself.
And that cult of history is key here, isn't it?
Yeah.
The idea that history is the ultimate reality.
Absolutely. The book traces this line of thought from Vico through Hegel to Marx. The world becomes knowable only through what humans create or do within history.
So history itself becomes the source of meaning and morality.
Essentially, yes. And if history is the ultimate judge, then whoever controls the narrative of history or claims to embody its endpoint, well, they control everything else.
Which brings us to Hegel. The book mentions something quite specific about him: funding from Masonic groups. Why is that detail highlighted?
It's presented as a crucial piece of the puzzle. The claim is that these groups were interested in promoting the idea of a state religion, something to replace the traditional church's authority.
How did Hegel's philosophy help with that?
By positioning the modern state as the ultimate guarantor and embodiment of freedom, sort of implying you don't need to defend freedom from the state anymore, Hegel's system subtly gives the state itself a kind of spiritual authority.
So the state becomes the new church, in a way.
It absorbs that spiritual function. It effectively restores the cult of Caesar, giving ultimate, almost divine authority back to the political power. That, the book argues, is the underlying goal.
And this current finds its modern expression in what the book calls the American Empire.
Yes, the third great metamorphosis. It acknowledges the American Revolution's achievement implementing the secular state, formally separating religion from political power.
But it sees a contradiction at its heart.
A fundamental one. The system is described as aristocracy de facto, democracy de jure. Real power held by elites or secret groups, but outwardly an ever-expanding promise of popular rights.
Democracy in name, oligarchy in practice. How does that hold together?
Well, the book's point is that it's inherently unstable. The virtues that did provide cohesion, discipline, shared ethics, a sense of common purpose, these weren't generated by democracy or capitalism.
Where did they come from then?
They were inherited, received, ready-made from the underlying Christian civilization, the ethical bedrock, you might say.
And the argument is, as that bedrock erodes through secularization,
the contradictions explode. You get this impossible combination. Theoretically unlimited individual rights alongside increasingly sophisticated surveillance, bureaucratic control, and the kind of mind manipulation techniques we discussed.
creating that state of paralysis again.
Yes, the perfect condition for keeping people dependent on the state bedel, the managing bureaucracy, #tag outro. So if we pull it all together, the central crisis described in Au Jardin des Afflictions is this struggle, this tension between two forces the author calls Leviathan and Behemoth.
Leviathan being.
The spirit of political power, rebellion, history as the ultimate force, and Behemoth. That's blind submission to nature, to the cosmos, to physical determinism.
And without the vertical.
Without that spiritual axis, the connection to God, the reality of the individual soul, there's no way to balance or reconcile these two drives. They just fight it out.
Leading to.
Constant conflict, and ultimately, the book fears the victory of Behemoth, the reduction of everything to just physical cause and effect, the end of genuine human freedom.
Is there any way out proposed?
Yeah.
Any resistance?
The conclusion points towards the major spiritual traditions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Taoism. It argues they are the only remaining source of genuine legitimacy, the only moral framework that stands outside of and can actually judge political power.
Even democratic political power.
Especially when it makes totalizing claims, yes. These traditions provide the ethical constraints that can potentially limit the state's relentless growth.
Okay. So that leaves us, the listener, with a pretty challenging thought to grapple with. If religion is supposed to be the ultimate judge of all political systems, what actually happens when a society's leaders, its intellectuals, start treating the political system itself as the highest spiritual authority?
Right. When Caesar is effectively reborn in the state.
How do we even find true spiritual grounding then? Especially if, as the book hints, even the traditional religious institutions might get caught up in these historical power games, lost in the fine mess of it all. Where do you look for that vertical connection then? That's the deep dive you now need to take for yourself.